We've been on a bit of a Nazi medal binge of late, having already covered the Blood Order medal and the 20th of July wound badge in depth. And since we plan to cover way more of the weird and rare ones, it got us thinking that we really should take the time to nail the basic Nazi era military medals and awards before we get too carried away. Not only because they are interesting in their own right, despite there being more common, but also due to the fact that since so many of the more fancy medals are derivatives of the common ones or invoke them in some way, it will be a legitimately useful foundation for later videos. So with that in mind, today we're going to be having a quick blast through 6 of them, giving you the basics of their name, their appearance, how and when they were awarded, as well as how many of them were awarded if that information is known. So with all that, let's begin. First up, we have the Medaille Winterschlacht in Osten, 1941 to 1942, or Winter Battle in the East, 1941/42 medal, which we will simply call the Eastern Medal to keep things simple. This one does exactly what it says on the tin, being established on the 26th of May 1942 to recognise the efforts of both specifically German troops as well as Axis troops more broadly during the absolutely brutal winter of 1941 through 1942 on the Eastern Front. Most of them were made of zinc, and they were all given a gunmetal grey finish with a polished silver rim. The obverse side displayed the German eagle clutching a swastika with a laurel branch behind it, symbolising victory, while the reverse carried the inscription Winterschlacht in Osten 1941-42, which translates to Winter Battle in the East 1941/42, along with a crossed sword and laurel branch. On top of that, as you can see, it also featured the iconic German Stahlhelm, specifically an M1935 model, if you're interested, perched atop a hand grenade. Don't forget that with some exceptions, German hand grenades often look like this instead of this. As for the ribbon, that was red with a central black and white stripe, which was intended to symbolise the bloodshed and snow encountered during the campaign. It's also worth noting that the Eastern Medal, despite its seemingly very broad focus, did actually have specific conditions that had to be met to be eligible to receive it. It wasn't just the case that everyone who ever stepped foot on the Eastern Front that winter got their hands on one. And as for what those conditions were, they would be that the soldiers had to have served a minimum of 14 days in active combat over the period in question, or 60 days not actively fighting, but still within a designated combat zone. Flight crews also got their own special criteria in recognition of the fact that while they were exposed to a lot of enemy fire, they didn't exactly hang around in combat for multiple days at a time. And so they got themselves an Eastern Medal for completing 30 aerial sorties. And even further still, all of the aforementioned criteria could be circumvented by a soldier of any type if they sustained frostbite injuries, and that's in addition to still being eligible for the wound badge we discovered in a previous video. It could be awarded posthumously too, with every single Wehrmacht and SS service member who died in the line of duty on the Eastern Front being automatically eligible for it. The Eastern Medal will ultimately stay on the books until October 1944, i.e. around the time the Eastern Front became the home front. This may seem odd at first, given that it had been created specifically to commemorate the winter of 1941 through to 42, but its long-lived nature was due to the fact that the criteria were retroactively slackened with time, making more and more soldiers eligible for it. And thanks to this continual slackening of the award criteria, the Eastern Medal was one of the most common medals given out by Nazi Germany, with over 3 million of them being awarded by the time it was pulled. We're willing to bet that quite a few of you have already heard of the Ursens Cross, or Iron Cross, as it's just a tad famous after all. What you may not know, however, is that it actually massively predates Nazi Germany, with it first being created back in 1813 by King Frederick III of Prussia, who wished to honour the bravery of his soldiers fighting in the Napoleonic Wars, with it later being revived for basically every war that Prussia and later Germany got itself embroiled in. Worry not, however, because while this means there's an absolute plethora of different Iron Crosses out there, it's easy to tell them apart, as every different iteration of the medal is emblazoned with the year that the conflict it commemorated began, as you can see here on the Franco-Prussian War one, and here on the World War I version. Further to just that, they also had some unique gubbins placed in their centre to represent the leader whose name they were issued in. With that in mind, can you guess what was stuck on the World War II version? That's right, a big old swastika, as you can see here. Come World War II, the Iron Cross had also evolved to have multiple different classes with ever increasingly strict award criteria, and thus prestige attached to it. On the bottom of the totem, you had the Iron Cross Second Class, which took the form of a normal medal, i.e. with a ribbon it dangles off, and could either be worn properly, mounted on the left breast if one wished to be fancy, or simply with the ribbon wrapped through the second buttonhole of a tunic from the top down for daily wear. And if it was worn in the latter such way, typically the actual medal itself was removed and stored, with just the ribbon itself being worn. Note more generally too that this was a common method of wear for all German medals that came with ribbons, with them all being looped through the same buttonhole, stacked on top of one another, with the most prestigious one on top, layering down to the least prestigious one on the bottom. For the Iron Cross First Class, however, it had no ribbon at all, and instead was pinned directly onto the left breast pocket of the wearer. Again, just like ribboned medals, soldiers could easily stack multiple different medals and awards on here, with the more prestigious ones being placed further up. Note too, contrary to what you may imagine, German soldiers often, but not always, wore their medals into combat, but basically never properly mounted, instead keeping the ribbons on the tunic through the buttonhole and the ribbonless ones pinned to the chest. There was never an official order for or against doing so, at least from the very top, and instead the choice was usually made by the individual soldier at any given time. And then above the Iron Cross First Class, you had another rank of the award, the Ritterkreuz des Eisernen Kreuzes, or Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross. And just to complicate things even further, this level of the medal was itself split into 5 different sub-levels: the normal Knight's Cross, the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords and diamonds, and finally the Knight's Cross with golden oak leaves, swords and diamonds. Most interestingly of all, however, the Knight's Crosses were worn in a very unusual place, around the neck. This is due to the fact that they were so high up there in terms of prestige that they really weren't common awards at that point, and this placement, which is only shared with a very small amount of other exceptionally rare medals, was intended to reflect that fact, giving them their own special place to be on full and clear display. There are also even more prestigious variants above the Knight's Crosses, but we won't worry about them, partly due to the fact that they were so few and far between that we would really be getting away from the common medal theme of today's video. But it's also that they had a totally different awards criteria and were given out on some of the most famous and successful German soldiers of the war. So they really deserve a whole video dedicated to them later down the line. And that brings us nicely to what the Iron Cross's award criteria actually was. In a nutshell, and it was basically the same all the way from the second class through to the various Knight's Crosses, some variation of bravery, tactile decision-making, and quality leadership, with the second class typically being awarded for exceptional bravery and leadership during a specific operation or single event, the first class being the same, but for multiple occasions, and generally only to those who had earned the second class, and the Knight's Cross being given for exceptional bravery or leadership that had a notable impact on the outcome of an entire battle. And again, typically, it was awarded to those who had already received the prior award, in this case, the first class. Following all of that, it can be difficult, we know, but given that it has so many variations and such a surprisingly vague awarding criteria, trying to sum up the Iron Cross and still be accurate is actually quite a difficult thing to do. As for how many were awarded, we don't have an exact figure, but it's typically touted that 4.5 million second classes, 300,000 first classes, and 7,000 Knight's Crosses of all types were awarded from its instigation on the 1st of September 1939 to the final award on the 6th of May 1945. Now, very much in parallel to the Iron Cross, we have the Kriegsverdienstkreuz, or War Merit Cross, introduced by Hitler himself on the 18th of October 1939. It was a decoration to honour the contributions of non-combatants to the war effort, filling a gap left by the Iron Cross, which was limited only to combat-related acts. With this in mind, it wasn't just limited to military personnel, as both civilians and foreigners working in the Reich's interests were also eligible to receive it. And just like the Iron Cross, the War Merit Cross also came in multiple different classes and variants, all of which share the same fundamental design, which for the War Merit Cross is that of an 8th pointed Maltese cross with a reef-surrounded swastika sat at its centre. As for the variants, there's 2, one for combat-related services and another for non-combat feats, or as the Germans called it, the furtherance of the war effort. The former variant came with crossed swords between the arms of the cross, while the latter did not. Then there were multiple different classes of the medal, all of which could be awarded in both the non-combat and combat variant. These classes were also inspired by those of the Iron Cross, the ones on offer being the War Merit Cross Second Class, the War Merit Cross First Class, and the Knight's Cross of the War Merit Cross. You can see the physical differences on the screen now, but we would draw particular attention to the Knight's Cross of the War Merit Cross because, like the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, it was to be worn on the neck. As for its award criteria, like the Iron Cross that it walked in the shadow of, the War Merit Cross was given out under remarkably vague criteria, essentially being whenever a suitably pipped up officer who had some recommendation forms to hand thought the individual question had done a good enough job to warrant it. To give you a general idea, the version with swords, the one for combatants, would be dished out for things like leading logistical support in a combat zone, and the non-combatant one when an administrator had tackled a particularly mean pile of paperwork, a factory worker had gone above and beyond his production quota, or a diplomat had done some top-tier schmoozing that led to the right getting a diplomatic butty of some kind. With an award criteria like that, it will probably come as no surprise to learn that a lot of this one were given out, with around 6.1 million War Merit Cross second classes with swords being given out, and 1.5 million of its non-sworded counterpart. As for the Tartier ones, 480,000 first classes with swords were dished out, as compared to 90,000 first classes without swords. And the Knight's Cross version, which was actually quite rare, had 211 awarded with swords and 48 without. Since our last two medals have been rather complicated ones, each with a million different variations and differences, let's look at a nice and simple one now, and that'd be the Deutsches Schutzwall Ehrenzeichen, or West Wall Medal. Instituted on the 2nd of August 1939, so just before the outbreak of World War II, it was created to honour individuals who'd been involved in the construction of Germany's extensive fortifications along its western border, which the Germans called the West Wall, but we remember much better as the Siegfried Line. This, naturally, was built as a counter to a potential French invasion, and while it was no way as substantial as the Maginot Line, it was still quite the effort by Nazi Germany and took a crazy amount of manpower and resources to see constructed. To begin with, the eligibility was only for those who had directly contributed to the wall's physical construction between the 15th of June 1938 and the 31st of March 1939, this being the period in which the vast bulk of the work was done. But later, this was further expanded to those who had manned it following its completion up to the 13th of November 1939, with those receiving the award under this revision having to have spent at least 10 weeks stationed at the fortifications. And then on the 10th of October 1944, following an upgrade programme to the West Wall after the Allied invasion of France, the criteria was expanded yet again to include the workers who had laboured on those upgrades. Technically, this late war expansion of the medal was also considered a completely new award, although its physical design didn't change. The only indication of this fact at all was that those who had received it the first time around and were eligible for the new one were entitled to wear a 1944 bar on their original ribbon to signify the dual award, but it was a moot difference ultimately, as this bar was produced in tiny numbers and hardly anyone received it. So between that and the fact that the medal itself was exactly the same, basically no one at the time took any notice of the distinction. And even if they did notice it, they were even less likely to care, as this medal was not well regarded within the military. Not that you'd be actively thought less of for having it, mind you, but given the fact that the majority of those awarded for it were only given it for physical labour, and that even those who manned it during the award period saw basically no combat, with even the French Saar offensive not actually reaching the line, it was typically considered an easy medal by German soldiers. As for its design, as you've seen on the screen multiple times now, it was an oval-shaped bronze design, with the early ones actually being made from bronze and the later ones from a bronze-plated zinc. And on the reverse side carries an inscription reading "Für Arbeit zum Schutze Deutschlands," or "To the worker, honour, to the homeland, defence." And on the front is a very appropriate image of a bunker with some tools, and of course, because it is a Nazi-era medal, we have our party imagery, which in this case was a full-blown Reichsadler-style eagle, rather than just a swastika on its own. And on both sides, there's also the now familiar oak wreath around the lot. The ribbon is simple enough too, just pure dull gold with some white stripes running through it. When it comes to how many were awarded, we have some precise information, as we know that exactly 622,064 were handed out come the 31st of January 1931, when all who were eligible for its initial criteria had gotten it. But we don't exactly know how many were given out in the late war batch, with most estimations placing it in the region of a further 200,000 or so. Next up, we have another reasonably simple one, specifically the Infanterie Sturmabzeichen, or Infantry Assault Badge, instituted on the 20th of December 1939 by General Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch. This award was given out to recognise a soldier's repeated trialling by combat. It came in two varieties, silver and bronze, but unlike the other awards and medals, the specific colour of a badge had no bearing on its prestige, and instead the different colours simply represented different branches of service, with the bronze award being for mechanised and motorised infantry, and the silver award being for dismounted old school infantry. Soldiers from other branches were flatly ineligible for the award, with them getting the Allgemeines Sturmabzeichen or General Assault Badge instead. We won't worry about this one, however, now that you've seen what it looks like, as it really is an infantry assault badge, but just for everyone else. As for the award criteria for those who are eligible, that was pretty straightforward. To have taken part in at least 3 separate infantry assaults, counterattacks, or reconnaissance missions under fire on different days. Design-wise, as you've seen on screen multiple times now, the infantry assault badge was oval in shape and measured approximately 47mm by 61mm. It featured an eagle clutching a swastika at the top, with a K98 rifle bearing a fixed bayonet crossing diagonally across the centre. Oak leaves also adorned the sides, again symbolising military strength and honour. It also had no ribbon and was worn Iron Cross first class style. It is believed that 941,000 infantry assault badges were dished out during the war, but numbers by variant are hard to come by, in no small part due to the fact that it was awarded entirely at the tactical level by field officers, and so no comprehensive full set of paperwork was ever created, much less survive the war. Remember when we said that the General Assault Badge was there to fill the gap for everyone not covered by the Infantry Assault Badge? Well, that wasn't quite accurate, as the Panzerforce actually had its own specific version too, and that would be the Panzer Kampfabzeichen, or Panzer Badge, instituted on the 20th of December 1939 by Walter von Braustitz again. The award was oval in shape, measuring 42mm by 61mm, and had a prominent depiction of a Panzer Kampfwagen 4 tank positioned on grassy terrain front and centre, with its tracks extending beyond the badge's border. This central image was surrounded by a wreath of oak leaves, and the whole thing was surmounted by the Wehrmacht eagle holding a swastika. It too came in bronze and silver versions, with the silver badge being awarded to actual armoured vehicle crews, while the bronze one was for the crews of armoured vehicles in mechanised infantry divisions, as well as supporting personnel within proper tank units, mechanics, flatbed drivers, things like that. As the war progressed, new special versions of the badge were introduced for soldiers who had participated in 25, 50, 75 or 100 engagements. These badges featured gilded elements, with a number of engagements displayed on a plaque at the base of the wreath, as you can see on screen now. We also have a better idea of how many of these were actually awarded, and it would appear that it was pretty rare, with most sources indicating that approximately 22,000 silver awards were given out compared to 12,600 bronze ones. For this reason, we were reluctant to include this one, but did for 2 reasons. Firstly, it just felt right to cover all of the assault badges in one fell swoop, and secondly, because collectors and enthusiasts speak like the Panzer Badge was a common award anyway, so what the hell, there it is. And that should just about do us for today. We really were torn on what to include in this one, as the Nazi war machine did hand out a lot of bling, and so a video with these chapter lengths that was truly comprehensive could easily end up being hours long. But we didn't wish to overstay our welcome, so we ended up just focusing on the real core stuff, the medals and awards that you'll see on every war movie, every reenactment, and in every video game, that kind of thing. And now, thank the Lord, we can reference this stuff in future videos without having to completely derail our flow to explain it. So jobs are good as far as we're concerned. End of video. Goodbye.